What up, Cavs Nation? I'm your host, Ethan Sands, and I'm back with another episode of the Wine and Gold podcast. And joining me today, Chris Fedor, cleveland.com, Cavs beat reporter. And Chris, if what once was a very slow, very quiet offseason, in 1 week, the Cleveland Cavaliers have taken the league by storm once again, and the latest being adding James Harden to the roster officially. Let's get into the contract details of this new contract. The Cleveland Cavaliers and James Harden have agreed to a 3-year, $97 million fully guaranteed deal, including a third-year player option and a 15% trade kicker. But on top of this, there's historical value in this contract as well. The career earnings for James Harden now will reach $511 million, making him the fourth player in NBA history to eclipse $500 million mark. That's joining LeBron James, Kevin Durant, and Stephen Curry. James Harden will turn 37 next Wednesday on August 26th, and when the 11-time NBA All-Star officially signs, he'll have garnered $90 million contract, which is just the second player in NBA league history to do so after the age of 37 or older, joining LeBron James. So, Chris, what do you think about this contract? And it's a little bit more than we might have expected.
Also, there's another move coming for the Cavs at some point because they are hard capped by the first apron after the sign and trade that they made with Denver for Peyton Watson. And I'm told that James Harden's starting salary in year one is going to be around $30.5 million. So the Cavs have had conversations about the possibility of a waive and stretch for Cam Whitmore. Whitmore being somebody that they acquired in that mega 5-team deal that also included Trey Mann going to the Washington Wizards, Dennis Schroeder going to the Charlotte Hornets, and Cam Whitmore and his salary savings coming to the Cavs. They have had conversations internally about the possibility of waiving and stretching Whitmore and not having him on this roster. They've also had conversations about another piece toward the back end of their roster being traded as well to create the kind of financial flexibility that they would need to sign James Harden. There's nothing that is going to prevent this deal from happening from what I understand, but there is going to have to be another move that comes for the Cavs, just given the way that their salary cap situation is right now and being hard capped by the first apron. But I think you're right, Ethan. I think to some degree it's a little bit higher than what was originally anticipated, but it's in the general range of what was anticipated. When we talked about James Harden declining his player option in the final year of his deal and becoming a free agent and working with the Cavs throughout the course of the summer, this is the general construct that we talked about. There were questions about what was the annual salary going to be. There were questions about, was there going to be a player option? Was there going to be a team option? Was there going to be no option? There were questions about what was the starting salary. There were questions about 2 years versus 3 years. But this is generally where the Cavs and James Harden were going to land. I think part of the reason why the annual salary is a little bit higher, and part of the reason why he got the player option in year 3, and part of the reason why it's a 3-year deal as opposed to a 2-year deal, is because James was willing to work with the Cavs all off season and gave them financial flexibility to explore different pathways to try and improve this roster. And this was the reward, in a way, for him being willing to work with the Cavs and being so flexible with the Cavs.
And I think we've had that conversation, right? It's an understanding of not only what James Harden was able to do and willing to do for the organization, but also how he was working behind the scenes. We had talked earlier into the offseason about how he was actively recruiting LeBron James. Now we're hearing that he was actively recruiting Peyton Watson after the LeBron James series didn't come to fruition, right? So that is important to the team building of this Cleveland Cavaliers organization. And I think what James Harden is kind of ushering out the factor of maybe he wasn't fit to work in certain locker rooms. Now he's showing himself as someone that is willing to cooperate not only with an organization, but to the future of what a team might be. And I think that's extremely important, not only to what James Harden's narrative is around the NBA, but what his legacy is going to end up being. Because we know there's basically one thing on his resume that is missing, and that is winning an NBA championship. So he's doing everything in his power to walk away from this game with an NBA championship on that resume. So, Chris, I do want to pivot slightly and get into the Cam Whitmore situation because you mentioned it early on. We understand that now with James Harden's numbers confirmed, Cam Whitmore will not be in the picture, and one of the three things are possible to happen. They can stretch and waive him for an undrafted free agent signing. They can move him for a player around less than $1.6 million, or they could absorb into space by another team, allowing for up to $3.8 million signing in a different area. Which one do you think makes the most sense for the Cleveland Cavaliers? What are you hearing behind the scenes? And obviously, understanding where this Cavs team might be lacking still in their roster, where do you think the biggest impact would come for this organization?
I think waive and stretch is one that is a high probability at this point, but it's very similar to the conversations that we've been having over the last couple of weeks. There are what if scenarios in play. There are different levers that this organization can pull. And we saw that kind of play itself out. Once the Cavs made the deal for Dennis Schroeder with Charlotte, they agreed to that deal. Now, all of a sudden, they knew what they had to work with from a financial standpoint. And then the Peyton Watson domino fell, and then the James Harden domino fell. So sometimes these what if scenarios come to fruition, and then you have a better understanding of where you sit from a salary perspective and from a team building perspective and from a roster construction standpoint. So I think what we talked about in the aftermath of the Peyton Watson deal is that it was going to be a cluster on the wing for somebody like Cam Whitmore. And that's why I said don't even include him in these conversations with Jalen Tyson and Peyton Watson and some of these other guys, because it was about the name on the piece of paper and it was about his dollar contract compared to Trey Mann's. The way that the Cavs roster is set up, it is more beneficial for them to create more savings by moving on from Cam Whitmore in some aspect of it. I do think waive and stretch is a high probability, but I would not rule out them just sending Cam Whitmore into space. I would not rule out them seeing if they could trade Cam Whitmore and his contract for a player that makes a little bit less than that, because they never acquired Cam Whitmore for the player or for the on-court impact. And I think they feel pretty good about how their roster sets up generally. Could they improve the depth? Of course. Could they strengthen and fortify the bench? Absolutely. But there are a lot of pieces in place now that the Cavs believe in, that they think they can rely on coming into this season. There are some young guys that were buried on the depth chart over the last couple of years that are now going to get a bigger opportunity because some of the movement that has already taken place here this offseason. They did have a plan to expand the role of Naquan Tomlin if he's ready for it. So I think when you look at the way that the roster is set up, the guys that are going to be part of the every night rotation that are going to matter most to this team, a majority of them are internal options that were already here in the player development pipeline. So they weren't really looking at, hey, Cam Whitmore is going to be in the rotation or Whitmore is going to play a bunch of minutes throughout the course of the regular season. So can they find somebody that can just provide some depth, provide some insurance, maybe give them a little bit of a developmental aspect of things? Kenny Atkinson and this coaching staff can kind of get their hands on a guy who makes a little less money than Cam Whitmore so they can create those savings. I think all of it is certainly in play. But over the last 24 hours, the phrase that has been used most consistently and most frequently is waive and stretch.
And I think that's completely understandable, obviously, with what we learned about Cam Whitmore, what we learned about this situation. But I think it also ties into the factor of what James Harden means to this organization now, right? And where this organization is trying to go. And we understand that there are other teams around the league that have 15 or more players already on their roster. Right. So that means that they're also going to have to waive some of these players, which means that the Cavs have the opportunity to potentially pick up on some of these players as well. So, Chris, when we're talking about potential either undrafted free agents, when it comes to veteran minimums, players on the market that could become available or already are available, who comes to mind? Because when I'm looking through this list, I'm thinking DeMar DeRozan, Bruce Brown, Dorian Finney-Smith, Karis LeVert, Kyle Kuzma, Who piques your interest for the Cleveland Cavaliers?
Well, I mean, if you're talking about Dorian Finney-Smith and you're talking about Kyle Kuzma, those caliber of players that aren't free agents, I would just turn around and ask, what are the Cavs giving up to get any of those guys? Or what's the scenario that plays itself out so that those guys come to Cleveland? Do you really want another high-priced guy on this roster? Part of the reason why the Cavs moved on from Dennis Schroeder is because they said, based on our salary cap situation, how close we are to the apron and still needing to come to an agreement with James Harden, we can't afford Dennis Schroeder. We can't justify paying our backup point guard $15 million annually. Part of the reason why they moved on from Max Strus is because he was going to be a free agent at the end of this year. But it was also, this is a guy who has dealt with injuries in back-to-back seasons. At one point, we did replace him in the starting lineup with Dean Wade. Dean Wade's no longer here, but we could theoretically replace him again in the starting lineup, this time with Jalen Tyson or something like that. So the point is, every player has a contract. And these front offices are looking at it saying, the value that you bring to our organization, does it match the contract that you have, the role that you have for our organization? Does that match the contract that you have? And I just think it would be surprising to me if anybody with a high price would be coming to Cleveland for the remainder of this offseason, because it just doesn't feel like they have expendable pieces to get those kinds of players. Now, DeMar DeRozan is an interesting case, right? It's a little bit different. This is a free agent. This is a longtime veteran. The kind of money that you would have to pay him in free agency is not exorbitant. He does have a relationship with James Harden. James Harden and DeMar have talked throughout the course of this offseason about the possibility, emphasis on possibility, of coming to Cleveland, because James Harden didn't know that the Cavs were going to make a deal for Peyton Watson, right? So he was just doing everything that he could behind the scenes to talk to guys that were possibilities for the Cavs, talk to guys that the Cavs would theoretically be interested in. So I would say when it comes to the Cavs, a lot of their rotation is relatively set at this point. And I think what they would potentially add to this roster moving forward is more of a depth insurance piece. Maybe somebody similar or in the role or in the mold of a Thomas Bryant type. So it doesn't mean that there aren't people available from some of these other teams, but the Cavs would have to ask themselves, would a trade make sense? Does their salary fit our current structure? Are they worth the salary that they already have? All of those things have to come into play. The other thing that I think we have to say here, Ethan, when it comes to James Harden, yeah, maybe it's a little bit more from a financial perspective for a guy who's about to be 37 than what some fans would like. But I don't look at this as a significant overpay for the Cavs. I mean, if you think about some other players across James Harden is a future Hall of Famer. James Harden is somebody who played well for the Cavs during the time he was here. We talked about it. During their 18-game playoff run, he was one of 3 guys that had a positive on-off net differential. It was him, it was Dean Wade, and it was Jared Allen. So it's not like James Harden was solely responsible for the Cavs not advancing beyond the New York Knicks in the Eastern Conference Finals. If anything, James Harden had to play a big role in the Cavs even getting to the Eastern Conference Finals. The way that he played against Toronto, the way that he played against the Detroit Pistons. And I think there's a path to improvement with James being more comfortable in the system, more comfortable around his teammates, more comfortable in the role that he's going to have for this team, and maybe the Cavs getting an even better version of James, even at 37, an even better version because of the familiarity aspect of it and the chemistry aspect of it than what they got for the 4 months that he was here after coming from the Clippers. So even though he is a little bit older, I don't think you look at this, say, this is the kind of deal that is going to be prohibitive to the Cavs. This is the kind of deal that is going to kill your salary cap situation, or this is a quote-unquote overpay. I mean, Tyler Hero makes more than James Harden with this particular contract. I think we can say that James Harden is a better basketball player than Tyler Hero, even at this stage of his career. I think we can sit here and say that Jalen Suggs, who also makes more than James Harden, Emmanuel Quickley, who also makes more than James Harden, they're not as reliable as James. Jordan Poole, who makes more than James Harden, not as reliable as James. So I do understand there's an element of sticker shock, especially when you're talking about somebody who's going to be 37 years old. But James is the kind of player, the productivity, the reliability. This is about what those guys that perform like he does, this is about what they get paid. They certainly don't get paid $15 million annually, right? They don't usually get paid $20 million annually. Guys like James Harden, who are capable of what he's capable of, that are as productive as he is, as impactful as he is, they usually get between $30 and $60 million annually. So I think this is about the right range for somebody like James, and I don't think it's going to be prohibitive when it comes to other team building stuff moving forward for the Cavs.
Let me put it this way, Chris. When I looked at this agreement deal, I was first looking at the 3 years, right? Because as you mentioned, he's going to be 37 next week. This contract, although there is a player option for the third year, he could be on the roster through age 39 season. So, although I agree with you, I don't think this is necessarily an overpay. Fully guaranteed was the second thing that I was looking at. Fully guaranteed is a big notion for a player that could be on your roster at 39 years old. But the other portion of this that cannot go unsaid, cannot go unnoticed, is the fact that when Donovan Mitchell has been off the floor, the Cleveland Cavaliers before James Harden looked almost unplayable because they did not have a reliable factor that was able to curate and change the offense the way that James Harden can. When James Harden was on the floor this year, even without Donovan Mitchell, it looked as though they still had life. They still had an opportunity to win ball games, and they were able to, even though the defensive aspect necessarily wasn't there at all times, the offense didn't feel like it just stagnated or crumbled in certain instances, right? It continued to go in a different flow. It continued to go with a different pace. And I think the Cleveland Cavaliers and Kenny Atkinson and Kobe Altman recognize the importance, especially with Donovan Mitchell also entering his 30th year of life, age 30 season, that they need more creation, that they need more offensive stability that James Harden can bring, even though he's going to be 37. I still think James Harden can play up to an all-star caliber kind of performance. And I think that's what the Cavs are banking on. Also, the factor that they could be banking on James Harden potentially unlocking Evan Mobley over these next 2 to 3 years, which I think is extremely important when we understand the value of Evan Mobley elevating to an all NBA, perennial all NBA, or MVP type player, and how that impacts the Cleveland Cavaliers timeline and how that impacts their contention window when it comes to being in the contention of the Eastern Conference and for an NBA championship.
Well, here's the thing. If James didn't get a 3-year deal in this current construct, in the Cavs and James Harden's representation, they had a bunch of different conversations going all the way back to June when James made the decision that he did to not pick up his player option or opt into his contract for $42.3 million because he wanted a multi-year deal from the Cavs. He wanted a little bit more security in the Cavs. It was beneficial for them, for James to do that as well, because they gained financial flexibility. So during that time period, as it felt like a sleepy offseason for the Cavs, there were still conversations between members of the Cavs front office and James's representation about a bunch of different contract setups. There were 2-year constructs. There were 3-year constructs. There was, what if there isn't a player option? There was discussion about the potential starting salary. There was discussion about the potential rise in the contract. There was conversation about the potential for whatever it's going to be annually. And the bottom line is, if James would have gotten a 2-year deal as opposed to a 3-year deal, then you know what his reps would have said? We want more annual salary. We want a different salary number to start this contract. And then the Cavs would turn around and say, well, now we have to create more financial flexibility, and we can't really afford to give him a contract that starts at 34 million or 36 million. So it's also somewhat beneficial for us if you're going to take a little less money, especially at the beginning of the contract, if that means that we have to give you a third year that happens to be a player option year, that's just kind of the financial situation that we're in. And that's how those negotiations typically go, and that's how this negotiation went as well. And I think if the Cavs felt like it was going to be a hindrance to give him a third year, or they thought it was going to be prohibitive to team building or something along those lines, or it was going to hamstring them for a number of years, or if he wasn't going to be worth that particular number, then I think they would have tried to fight a little bit harder for something more like a 2-year deal. But the other thing is, James waited. He did the Cavs a favor. I think everybody can admit that. They do not have Peyton Watson today without James Harden doing what he has done throughout the course of this offseason. First, with his contract in June, and then by waiting to agree to a deal, signing a contract, being so flexible about the years and the annual dollars and all that kind of stuff. It would have been really, really, really difficult without James's help for the Cavs to get Peyton Watson. So because he was willing to help them and because they were in lockstep the whole time, I do think it was the Cavs, saying thank you for that. And the trade-off to that was that third year and a little less money annually and a little less money at the beginning of the contract so that it all can fit under the apron. And by the way, like, given where the Cavs were from a financial standpoint, just 8-9 months, I know fans don't care because they don't have their calculators out. This isn't their money. They're not the ones writing the checks. Dan Gilbert is one of the richest dudes in the entire world. So they're like, what's money? What's a contract? What's an apron? What's a tax? Who cares? You're just pay. Compete for a championship. So I know that fans don't love hearing about the financial aspect of things and getting really, really nerdy when it comes to the calculations of things. But, 9 months ago, the Cavs were in the second apron and they were not in a very good financial position. And for them to do all of this, bring back Donovan Mitchell, bring back James Harden, trade for Peyton Watson, keep the core four, the new core four intact, that's really, really good front officing. It's really good front officing to be able to do all of that, get out of the second apron, and stay below the first apron. There are people around the NBA, other executives around the NBA, that are looking at what the Cavs have done over the last year to get out of the second apron while keeping a championship-level team in place and saying, wow, that's pretty impressive. We might have to take some notes from them about how that got done. But also the part of the reason why it did get done is it's James. James helped them. And I think everybody will admit that. So the Cavs, when those situations occur, you have to reward the guy. And I do think part of his contract and what it looks like is partially a reward for his help.
Going back to what you had mentioned previously, really quickly about the comparison to other players' contracts that are roughly around James Harden, I think it's also important to note that Darius Garland is owed $87 million over the next 2 years, while James Harden just signed a contract for 3 years and $97 million, right? So it is still a flexibility move by the front office. And Chris, you got into exactly where I was going to go next. As of January 20th, 2026, the Cavs had $392 million on their books, a salary of $228 million and a tax of $164 million. They were the most expensive team in the NBA. They were over the second apron. As of August 20th, they're at $218, salary at $209, and the luxury tax of just $9 million. They've traded since then DeAndre Hunter, Lonzo Ball, Darius Garland, Max Strus, Dennis Schroeder. They've now acquired James Harden, Peyton Watson, Mario Hezonja, and Malik Thomas. So yes, I do agree that this is great flexibility, great movement by the front office. And I'm going to end this podcast by asking you, how do you grade the Cleveland Cavaliers front office and what they were able to accomplish this offseason, especially when it comes to the Eastern Conference hierarchy and where they rank when it goes into the 2026-2027 season? Because this is a question that I might pose to our subtexters coming in this next week.
I don't think this all of a sudden makes the Cavs offseason an A, okay? They don't have Giannis on this roster. They don't have LeBron on this roster. They don't have Jaylen Brown on this roster. All of those guys were available, and the Cavs theoretically had some moves that they could have made if they wanted to get at least one of those guys. And they chose not to, and they had their reasons for that. But that caliber of player coming to a place is a lot different than Peyton Watson. In saying that, they have accomplished a pretty good amount. They don't have to worry about the second apron. They don't have to worry about the first apron. They do have James and Donovan back. Hazonia, I think, is going to help. He's going to give them insurance and depth off the bench. I don't know how consistent he's going to be. I don't know how reliable he's going to be. There's a reason why he's making a minimum level contract. I like Peyton Watson a lot. I think he's going to be a really good fit for the Cavs. And it's the kind of piece, given his defensive upside, it's the kind of piece that felt like was going to be, if the Cavs didn't address it, and if they didn't get a guy like Peyton Watson, it felt like a piece that was going to be preventative for the Cavs in terms of competing for a championship, because they just weren't going to be good enough, to me, on the defensive end of the floor by losing Dean Wade and not having a guy that was capable enough on the defensive end of the floor to already replace him. Peyton Watson could. He could be that guy defensively. I also think that he raises their offensive ceiling too, because I think there are things that the Cavs can tap into that are different for Peyton Watson than what they already had in Dean Wade and what they already had in Max Strus. And if he continues to develop offensively, that's a big X factor in this whole thing. How much can that possibly supercharge the Cavs offense? So I think what they've done this offseason is that they raised their ceiling from where it already was, right? But they didn't raise it to a level that LeBron would have raised it to, or Giannis, or Jaylen Brown. So I do think that they're still generally in the same tier cluster that they were already in, but I think there's more of a pathway now, and it's a more realistic pathway to climb higher in that. If Peyton Watson works according to plan, if James Harden looks more comfortable, if Evan Mobley takes another step forward. So I think it's hard to say that all of a sudden these moves make it an A offseason, but I think it's a solid B for what they accomplished this offseason. And there was a time, Ethan, during this offseason where it looked like you could make an argument at least that Toronto might have passed them by. You could make an argument at least that Indiana, if Tyrese Halliburton was right, had a legitimate chance to pass them by. You could make an argument that some of these other teams in the Eastern Conference that were in that same tier cluster were going to pass them by or had the ability to pass them by. I think they fortified their place more in the Eastern Conference, and I think there's less worry that these other teams are actually going to pass them by. I think that's what this offseason has done for them.
I think the money is super important in this conversation. I don't know if I'm willing to go all the way up to an automatic B. It might be B minus C plus range for me based on where this offseason began. But I do agree with you that there was an argument early into the offseason where this could be a failure. You didn't get Giannis. You didn't get LeBron. You didn't get Jaylen Brown. What are you going to end up having? What are you going to end up doing? But obviously they have, and they're a true wing in Peyton Watson. They've gotten off a significant chunk of money. They're under the first apron currently. They're hard capped to the first apron. But there's also an understanding of they are giving themselves a fighting chance and believing in the roster that they've constructed to compete in the Eastern Conference, no matter who might be in front of them, whether that's Philly, whether that's New York, you name it.
I do still think New York and Philly is in front of them. I think New York's on a tier of itself. I think Philly is in tier 2 by itself. And then I think tier 3 is a big time mess. But I think the Cavs are more toward the top of tier 3 than the bottom of tier 3, which is different than a conversation that we were having about a month ago.
And as we talked about early on in this podcast, the Cavs offseason is not yet finished, right? They still have to find a way to get off Cam Whitmore, fill one more roster spot, and then we're going to continue to have conversations about what this offense, what this defense actually looks like going into training camp, going into the regular season and all these things. So we'll have to wait and see as things progress, as things come to fruition for this Cleveland Cavaliers organization. But this week has been an intriguing one, and it's been a step step in the right direction that Kobe Altman in the front office has taken to improve the Cleveland Cavaliers roster more than it had early on into this offseason. But with all that being said, that'll wrap up today's episode of the Wine and Gold Talk podcast. But remember to become a Cavs insider and interact with Chris, me, and Jimmy by subscribing to Subtext. Sign up for a 14-day free trial or visit cleveland.com/Cavs and click on the blue bar at the top of the page. If you don't like it, that's fine. All you have to do is text the word STOP. It's easy, but we can tell you that the people who sign up stick around because this is the best way to get insider coverage on the Cavs from me, Chris, and Jimmy. This isn't just our podcast, it's your podcast. And the only way to have your voice heard is through Subtext. Y'all be safe. We out.